immediately when I talked to her, I said, this sounds like a mold issue. Let's test him. And we tested him, and I believe he came back for over 10 different mycotoxins, many of which came from black mold, which is the worst on the market. It's typically what people are thinking about when they think about mold. And she saw the results immediately and said, we are leaving this house.
You're listening to the Healthy Parenting Handbook podcast, just the thing we all said we needed when we first became parents. I still remember that feeling of just, where is the handbook for this? I wanted instructions, and that's why I started the Healthy Parenting Handbook podcast. I'm your host, Katie Kimball from Kids Cook Real Food, and I bring together experts in the fields of health, parenting, nutrition, and more to help you, parents who so desperately want that information to raise the healthy, independent kids you want to have. Thank you for joining me to consult this Healthy Parenting Handbook, your guide to raising kids intentionally. Please leave an honest review, especially on Apple Podcasts, so that others can find us too. My guest today is going to talk a lot about functional health, functional nutrition, and really we're digging into eczema and toxic burden. This is a massively important podcast if your kids have skin issues or if you're just wondering about the toxic burden in your home. And believe me, it's encouraging and inspiring a lot more than it is fearful and just worrying about the world. Deidre Bloomquist is a functional nutritionist and studying naturopathic doctor who owns Always Growing Wellness, a virtual practice that serves clients across the United States. She leads a whole team of practitioners who work with women to resolve a wide range of digestive issues and hormone imbalances, as well as a dedicated pediatric practice focused on eczema. That's the part we're talking about today. She specializes in addressing complex health issues, but reducing toxic burden. And she's an advocate of assessing toxic burden in the preconception phase to not only support fertility, but to promote health and healing for generations to come. She's the author of Toxic Infertility, Detoxification and Solutions to Improve Natural Fertility. I myself learned a ton in this interview, particularly about the impact of the mother's toxic burden on the baby, some seriously jaw-dropping information and statistics. I hope you enjoy this interview. Deidre, thank you so much for being here. I know a lot of parents struggle with watching their kids suffer, and we don't want anything to go wrong for our kids. And so I'm really, really glad to share your wisdom today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
Well, I always want to start at the beginning. Like, what's your why? Why did you get into medicine in the first place? And then how did you move to a pediatric practice?
I got started in the pediatric space because I had a little boy. He's 4 years old now. And when he was about 9 months old, he started developing eczema. And it started as a really small spot on his chest near one of his armpits. And I was a first-time mom. And so I did all the things that I thought I should. I went to a naturopath first, and they said, I don't think he has eczema. I think he has a fatty acid deficiency, and we can do a probiotic. And we did that. And what happened is it just got worse. It was good advice, but it got worse. And so then I went to our pediatrician and I said, he's developing eczema. It's getting worse. What do we do here? And I had a great integrative pediatrician, and she was like, well, this has to do with gut health. And I was like, I completely agree. And so we started doing some different things in terms of my diet. He was breastfed at the time. We changed some things in my diet and his diet, and it just wasn't getting better. And so the next step at that point in time was, let's go do allergy testing. And so we went to do allergy testing, which is a blood draw. He was 11 months old at the time, which is so hard, mostly for me. He didn't care at all, but it was terrible for me. And it all came back negative. And so we were really stumped. And at that point in time, I was running stool testing on adults. And so I primarily started as an adult practitioner. We specialize in reversing infertility by focusing on gut health. And so we know a lot about gut health. I told the pediatrician that I was going to run a stool test on him to see if there were any pathogens. And she straight up told me, there's no way that he has pathogens at his age. And I was like, well, let's just see. And so I ran the stool testing, and it came back and was maybe the worst stool test I have ever seen in my life. For those who are familiar with markers like calprotectin is typically used to measure inflammation, and it's used to diagnose for things like IBD. Typically, you see them in the range of like 50 to 100. It was maxed out at 6,000 on his test. He had huge levels of inflammation, a lot of bacterial overgrowth, and a lot of parasitic overgrowth.
Whoa. And the pediatrician said, no way, don't even bother.
Yep.
Thank goodness for your mama intuition and the knowledge you already had.
Yeah. So it was huge. It gave us the answers we were looking for of like, what is actually causing this? I wrote him a protocol. I had never written a protocol for a child before. I put him on a protocol that was holistic, and his eczema was gone within a month, and it has never come back. And I ended up going down the rabbit hole a little bit more to figure out, like, why did this happen with his gut health? So for some perspective, I had been thinking about gut health. I know that gut health gets transferred to our children. And so prior to getting pregnant, I probably hadn't used antibiotics for 10 years. He was born at home. He was breastfed. I thought about all of these things. And so I was very shocked to see that his gut microbiome was in such disarray. And so my question was, why is this happening in the first place? And the thing that I didn't realize at the time was that a lot of my toxin burden had actually been transferred to him in utero. So, I had been exposed to mold in childhood that I never really had severe symptoms, but he did. And when I was younger, I had mercury amalgam fillings, and it transferred to him in utero. So when I did toxin testing on him, he had this huge toxin burden that had all come from me because it wasn't coming from our home.
That's so wild. I'm shocked that you even had mercury fillings.
Yeah.
Because you're a young woman. Like, they were still using them? What?
Yeah, absolutely. So I figured out that that was what had caused a lot of his GI issues. So yes, we rebalanced his gut, and that made a huge difference. But it led me down this huge path of, what is happening to other kids? Like, if I had the wherewithal to be intentional about gut health, what could possibly be happening for other kids? And so as I started sharing our story, I was sincerely overwhelmed with how many parents came out of the woodwork to say, my kids have eczema, my kids have really severe constipation or diarrhea that nobody can figure out. And so I ended up building an entire pediatric practice to support kids because there are so many that need help. And the beautiful part is kids are so resilient. They bounce back so quickly that we can usually help kids who have been suffering in a matter of for years in a matter of months where they feel better.
Wow. So that was it must be a little bit of a fun shift to get that, immediate gratification. Like, what we're doing is working.
Yeah.
So in your bio, it says you're a functional nutritionist. Can you sort of define that for people just so that we understand, like in your story, you did something that pediatricians said wouldn't work. Like, what's your background there?
Yep, absolutely. So I'm a functional nutritionist, which means that everything I do is holistic. I have been trained through Restorative Wellness Solutions as a master practitioner. And ultimately what that means is I can order a lot of different functional testing, everything from stool testing, blood chemistry. We do toxin testing. There's essentially no testing on the market that I don't have access to and know how to interpret and write protocols based off of. So when I'm creating protocols, they're going to be dietary, lifestyle, and supplement based. Supplements are always therapeutic. And really being used for a short period of time. And the key difference between me and somebody like a pediatrician or a naturopath is that I'm not diagnosing for disease. I'm looking for patterns on functional testing, and I don't use medication. So everything that I do is holistic in nature.
That was really actually very helpful because I'm often telling people like, the people ask me questions that are way, way, way beyond the scope of like, hey, I shared my interesting story and here's what we did. And they're like, can you answer this complex medical question? No, nope, I cannot. And they'll say, well, I know, I'll ask my doctor. And I'm like, yeah, well, just to throw it out there, your pediatrician may not know anything about root cause. They may not even care. And so I tell people often, like, try to look for a functional doctor, or a naturopath. I usually say functional doctor, but if they were to say, well, what does that mean? Or how do I find one? I'm like, oh, I wish you wouldn't have asked that question. So that was super helpful. So you're a functional nutritionist. Mm-hmm. And I love that you just said, like, I'm not diagnosing and looking for patterns. Incredibly helpful. Now that you've been working with kids for a couple years, what are some of the patterns you see? What are their biggest challenges in our toxic world?
Yeah.
I'm like afraid. I don't even want to know the answer. No, Deidre, don't say it. Okay, tell us. It's a podcast. We're supposed to learn stuff. Tell us something.
Yeah. We do see a lot of kids with parasitic issues. And I think that parasites are something that parents do know is part of childhood. A lot of kids, when they go to daycare or school, sometimes they will get things like ringworm, right? So we know that those things, we get ringworm or pinworms, those type of things really are very commonly addressed in childhood. But one of the things that we often don't think about is the other parasites that can cause health issues. So there are a lot of protozoan parasites that can cause health issues, even though we don't see them. It's not always these big, scary, like worms necessarily. And so we see a lot of kids with parasitic issues, and a lot of that has to do with their toxin burden. One of the things that I found over time and is actually indicated in the research is that parasites overgrow in host bodies when there is a toxin burden. So parasites are trying to keep us safe from the toxins in our modern world. And then the question really becomes like, what are those toxins for kids? And there's a lot of them. One of the biggest one we see is mold. Mold is something that a lot of people and parents in particular don't feel like could possibly be in their homes because they have clean homes and they have new homes. But what we realize is that it can be any water damage in a home. Mold does not need to be in a filthy home by any means to grow and cause health issues. We see a good amount of heavy metal burden, typically that's being transferred to kids in utero. So a lot of it isn't current exposure, but we do see a good amount of lead and aluminum that gets passed to kids. And then because of the way that children's toys are created, we do see a lot of BPA as well in children, just that they're touching a lot of things and putting them in their mouth naturally. And so they just have an exposure to those sorts of toxins that are impacting them, especially if they don't have the means to actually eliminate them effectively.
And that was going to be my question. I love that you just said, you totally led me into it, eliminate them effectively. So when I'm thinking of, okay, if my kid tests really high for any number of the toxins that you just mentioned, what do we do?
Right. We want them to eliminate them. And so, I think a lot of times in our culture today, parents do realize that there are toxins that kids are being exposed to. There's no way to avoid all of them. There is no point in stressing about avoiding all of them. If you are breathing air, if you are drinking water, you are being exposed to toxins in some capacity. And so we really want to be thinking about actually being able to remove them. So a lot of times when we see kids who have a high toxin burden, they have constipation. And so they aren't having a daily bowel movement regardless of their age. And there tends to be some misinformation out there about how often children should be having bowel movements, or parents feel like, I'm not having a bowel movement every day, so why would it make sense that my child is having a bowel movement every day? And we forget that bowel movements are the primary elimination pathway in the body to remove things so that they're not recirculating and then causing more damage in the body. So we want to make sure that kids are having a bowel movement daily, and if they're not, figuring out why that's happening. Things like bacteria or parasites or pathogens as a whole in the GI tract can cause constipation, but so can mold. It impacts the way that the brain functions and the way that it communicates with the GI tract, and it can slow down motility, which means that things can start to accumulate and cause more issues. But then we really want to figure out exactly what they're dealing with. I think a lot of times parents are doing a lot of research, especially through things like podcasts and looking on Instagram and TikTok and all kinds of things. And what they end up doing is trying to figure out what's happening. And a lot of times they're really close to the answer. When I talk to parents, they're so close. They know so much and are so well educated, but they're just missing one piece of the puzzle. And that is the missing piece to figure out what's happening. So I do think that symptoms can tell a lot about what kids are experiencing. And oftentimes there needs to be some type of testing to figure out exactly what their burden is so that you have the plan to move forward.
Makes sense. So a lot of people say test, don't guess. That's very common in functional medicine. And if we do a lot of guessing because testing feels expensive, I think. And it feels like, well, I don't know what test to run, or, I don't have the right practitioner to work with. We hit a lot of roadblocks, but typing something into Google or ChatGPT is very simple. But then we end up down this rabbit hole. I was loving watching your face when you're like, parents are so close. They get so close. Like if you're listening to this in your ear, like, or just, you had so much hope, and yet like pain for the parents because you're so close. But if you're not there, what are you going to do? And then, so to eliminate the toxins, pooping is a big deal, getting them pooping. And so that's where you would come in with diet, lifestyle supplements to just keep everything flowing.
Yep. So we want to make sure that elimination is happening. Then from there, we're really thinking about liver function. So, I think as adults, we typically think about liver function as like the big bad toxins, things like alcohol, but our livers detox everything that we come in contact with. And the same is true for kids. So we often don't think that kids have impaired liver capacity, but often they do. And if they have skin issues, it's typically a sign that there's a liver stagnation issue. So if the liver is not functioning effectively, I usually think of the body as pulling the emergency brake, as we have to get rid of this somehow. And so it starts to push things out through the skin. It's kind of a big red flag. So we know that the liver needs support. The liver is a huge detoxification organ. We're usually thinking about the kidneys as well. So for instance, if we see kids who are getting things like UTIs often, that's a sign that detoxification organs are having some additional burden on them. And then we really want to be thinking about letting cells let go of toxicity as well. So for instance, one of the things that we use a lot with kids is something called phosphatidylcholine. Phosphatidylcholine is a fatty acid, but it helps with cell membrane integrity. So when kids are in a toxic state, cells become very rigid and unable to release toxins. And phosphatidylcholine has been shown to allow cells to actually let go of these things so that they don't just continue to accumulate them. So ultimately what we're doing is we're creating a very personalized protocol, typically based on what that testing shows. So let's say it shows something like mold. We know that there's going to likely be some bowel support, liver support, something like phosphatidylcholine to support the cellular health at the smallest level, but then coming up with a strategy to actually remove those mycotoxins and mold. You know, with mycotoxin testing, it's a urine test. We like to do non-invasive testing for kids as much as possible. But mycotoxin testing is really important because it'll tell us the type of mycotoxins that kids have been exposed to, whether that's a current exposure in home via food or has been passed down in utero, because different mycotoxins bind to different things. And so there's a lot of different holistic binders that we can use to attach to those mycotoxins to make sure that we're actually eliminating them as they begin to recirculate through the body. But the other thing that we always want to consider is this concept of colonization when it comes to mold. Mold is a fungus. It produces spores, and the primary way that we come in contact or get sick from mold is we inhale those spores. And when those spores start to live in the sinuses and the GI tract, what happens is that fungus can then start producing those mycotoxins or the poison that actually makes us sick. So if kids are living in a moldy building, they then become the moldy building that is producing the poison and making them sick. So we have to address that fungus in them too.
Just to be clear, that's really gross, listeners. Like, that's colonization of mold in the body. Like, just don't think about that right before you're falling asleep. It'll probably give you nightmares. The really practical implication of that is that when we were first exposed to mold here in our house, literally in the last 6 months where this is a live situation, I said, well, one way to know if our bodies are being affected maybe would be to go away for a weekend. And then if we feel better, then it's possibly mold. Now, I did know a little bit about colonization or the potential of, and I said, if we don't feel better, we have no data. Like, that doesn't mean anything. But I think that's what you're saying is like, you could move away from the mold for a weekend or a week or months or a year, but it's in your body. And so that might not help. Location, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think people tend to feel better when they leave the environment, even for a short period of time of like a weekend, a week. They tend to feel a little bit better, but not 100% better. It does happen sometimes, especially with kids, because their bodies are small and they have high metabolic rates, that they just totally clear up and feel better in a short period of time. But it's not always the case because of colonization.
Man, oh, mister. So we've hit mold pretty hard. And then you talked about the heavy metals are often passed in utero. When you say that word toxic burden, like, I feel like I kind of know what that means, but I'm not sure if everyone will understand what toxic burden really means. What does that look like in a kid?
Toxic burden, when I think about it, is ultimately this bucket that gets filled, and everyone's bucket is going to be different ultimately. So the testing that we do on kids to assess their toxin burden is called a total tox. It's from Vibrant America. It's that urine test. So it's testing for the mycotoxins from mold. It screens for heavy metals, and then it's also looking at industrial chemicals. So things like pesticides, plastics, chemicals that come from personal care items, things like parabens and phthalates. So when we're thinking about this, it ultimately matters what that total load looks like, because all of these toxins go down very specific pathways for detox in the liver. So what we tend to find, and this is true for adults as well as kids, is that there are certain patterns that happen for kids where they accumulate certain toxins because those toxins go down a certain pathway in the liver. So let's say a glutathione pathway in the liver, for instance. Glutathione conjugation is one way that we can remove toxins from the body. Now, if they, for whatever reason, let's say have a glutathione deficiency, or they just have impaired capacity in that pathway, it means that the toxins that are reliant on that are going to accumulate over time. And that increases their total burden. And that's going to look different for everybody. So for instance, we work with a lot of siblings, and a lot of parents say their burden's got to be the same, right? And they both came from me. They both grew up in the same homes. They're exposed to the same things. And the truth is not always. They usually look different because of small genetic variations between kids. They're going to have different capacity to deal with things where their toxin burden might have some similarities, but they're probably very different. And we want to make sure that we're not missing anything that's very unique to those kids. So, and they usually see this where kids maybe have different presentations. So one has eczema, but no GI issues, and one has GI issues, but no eczema.
Mm-hmm. That makes total sense to me, and really all parents, because our kids are very different. They behave differently. They have different gifts and talents. And so, of course, like their toxic burden, sort of their bucket. And I like that picture, right? So the bucket could be filled with a ton of mold, or it could be filled with a little bit of mold and a little bit of BPA and a little bit of heavy metals, and then each person's bucket based on mostly genetics and past experience. Is that how big the bucket gets?
Yeah, genetics, different dietary preferences. So, if you have one child who's a little bit pickier or likes certain types of foods, they're getting different nutrients. If they have different stress levels, or honestly, even just constitution. So think about a child who maybe has a little bit more anxiety. That's going to change the way that their nervous system works, the way that their digestive juices are produced. It changes everything ultimately.
Always a good reminder that our stress and the way we respond to stress really impacts our physical health. And I don't think we talk about that enough. We're getting there. We're getting better as a society, especially in the natural health community. But it is so important to remember that we've got to teach our kids how to be resilient, how to, work on our stress. Do you do that with kids too?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of conversations. We primarily work with mothers. Mothers are typically the ones who reach out to us as the primary care provider. And so we have conversations a lot of times about what regulation looks like that is developmentally normal for that child, but then also talking about things like co-regulation, especially for new moms, first-time moms, is a huge conversation. And we know that, kids often don't have the tools to regulate their nervous system, and we have to be able to coach them on that and create those habits with them. And so it's a huge part of what we talk about with parents.
I love that. And that is honestly, that's really hard for me, step into the confessional here, because we've had a very good diet for many years. Like I feel like I teach my kids life skills and independence. But as far as emotional regulation, I am weak in that. Like it was something I was never taught. So it's very difficult to teach what you're still learning yourself. And I know it's important. So I'm going to keep working on it. But man, oh, mister, it's a tough one. So parents, focus on that. We every year for Life Skills Now summer camp, we have one or two camp leaders who will teach emotional regulation. And I think this year we have someone teaching specifically to parents co-regulation. So I'm thrilled to present that. I'm curious when I think about eczema, because my 19-year-old is dealing with a massive eczema flare, potentially because of the mold. We haven't tested, so we don't know. But I would love to hear some stories of kids. Like, what does the healing process look like once you get those puzzle pieces correct for the kid?
Yeah. So I would say, and this is a number that we're very proud of, 95% of the kids that we work with in my practice are fully clear after working with us, which is huge. Beautiful. And then the question I always get is, well, what happens to the 5%, right? And those 5% are still living in a moldy environment. So that's the big implicator of we always want to make sure that we aren't currently being exposed to something. So I've got a couple of stories I'd love to tell you. One is of a little boy. He was about 1.5 years old when mom came to work with us, and he had full body eczema, and she was doing a lot of things right. She had done a lot of research and just felt like she was missing something. They had moved into a home about a year prior, and she knew a lot about mold. I think she even had the home tested for mold when they moved in. And they moved in, and immediately when I talked to her, I said, this sounds like a mold issue. Let's test him. And we tested him, and I believe he came back for over 10 different mycotoxins, many of which came from black mold, which is the worst on the market. It's typically what people are thinking about when they think about mold. And she saw the results immediately and said, we are leaving this house. And they fortunately had parents who lived about 3 minutes away. So they went and lived with grandma and grandpa for a while. And she said that within 2 weeks of moving away, his skin was completely clear.
That was all it took. No supplements or anything.
Nope.
He needed relief.
Yeah, he got huge relief. So at that point in time, we did do some cleanup work just to make sure that there wasn't anything that had colonized his body, of course. We just wanted to make sure that nothing was coming down the pipeline in his future. And did do a lot of work, and we ended up seeing huge neurological changes for him. So when she brought him in, she had noticed that he started to regress in terms of speech. He was talking and then it went away. And then about a month after they had moved out, and we got a couple of things in place just to work on foundations and just his innate ability to detox, he started talking again, and it was full sentences and was just like a totally new human. So that's kind of the power of like how important it is to know if there's a mold issue in your home. And we typically recommend test on the body first before you go down the rabbit hole of looking in your home. And that way, you know, if you're looking for a really big issue or not.
Deidre, thank you for that story. Honestly, I think that'll be so encouraging to so many parents. And it's just the more we understand about, again, I keep picturing these puzzle pieces. Here he's, having neurodevelopmental regression and slowing down on the talking. And a lot of parents would be like, oh my gosh, he's got autism.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it was something we did, the human body is so complex and our environment is so complex. It's never just one issue. But yes, test the body, test the person. If you're getting sick from mold, then figure out where it's coming from. Love that. Love that. Yep. You said you had a couple stories.
Yep, I do. I've got, and this is probably more indicative of what we typically see happen with kids. So there was another little boy, he came in, and I want to say he's about 1 year old when he starts coming in for us, and he has really bad eczema. And it's the type of eczema where it's opening up, it's weepy. Mom is trying everything from a topical perspective. She's tried tallow and coconut oil and Tubby Todd and like anything that's available and marketed to moms for eczema. She's also come in with a gut health or like a stool test that she had done, had seen marketing for, called a Tiny Health. And Tiny Health is very popular, but it didn't really give her the answer she was looking for. It basically came back and said, well, his beneficial bacteria are low. He needs a probiotic. So she gave him a probiotic and was like, this isn't fixing anything. And he had open wounds on like his armpits and behind his knees and on his wrist. And he was so itchy that he was getting to the point where he was like physically opening up wounds on his body.
Baby.
I know. So sad. So they had him in mittens every day in order to make sure that he wasn't harming himself, of course. And so we worked with them we always work with parents for 6 months. It doesn't always take 6 months to get there. But we were about 3 months in and we got some foundations in place. We started addressing some parasitic overgrowths and started to work on mold because mom had actually been exposed to mold while he was in utero, while she was pregnant with him. And she didn't realize that it was going to be an issue. It was something where they had done a remodel and opened something up and she got exposed and was like, I'm fine. She felt fine. She had no symptoms whatsoever. And so he started having all of these issues. Well, 3 months in, his skin starts to slowly progress. So first it's no new flare-ups are happening. Then we start to see those wounds that were open healing. He's not itchy anymore. She told me the day that she was able to take the mittens off of him was huge, where they could like actually trust him to not harm himself, which then means he gets to be a normal kid and touch things the way that children are meant to from a sensory perspective. So we're about 5 months into the process right now with her, and his skin is extremely clear. There's only those really deep wounds that are still kind of scabbing and healing at this point, and it just takes some time to get through those things. But he's not itchy. There's no new flare-ups happening, and he can actually just be a normal, 1.5-year-old at this point in time.
Yay. Those are so lovely to hear. Do you see older kids too, or is this mostly happening with little babes?
We mostly see a lot of younger kids, but we do work with older children as well. So anybody under 18, we work with for pediatric side of things. And we do work with adults as well. As I mentioned, we have more of like a complex health illness adult side of our practice, and we support reversing infertility. But yeah, we work with kids of all ages. It's something that it tends to be a little bit easier when kids are really small and when kids are a little bit older. Kids between, 4 to 7 can be a little bit more challenging just in terms of getting the supplementation into them. It doesn't mean it's impossible by any means. It's just a little trickier.
Literally the process of like swallowing the pills or taking the powder without a fight. And
yes,
I can believe that. Oh my goodness. Well, Deidre, as a kids cooking teacher, I always want to ask about food. And I feel like prevention is lovely as well. So if a family is doing pretty well, like are there certain foods or dietary strategies that you just recommend to everyone as a functional nutritionist?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I think it's very important to get kids in the kitchen with you. So many times we work with kids who are picky eaters and they don't want to be eating foods. And a huge part of that is they're not involved in the process of what do we want to cook and getting them involved and getting them cooking with us. It makes it so much easier for them to see the whole journey and the outcome of their food and really enjoy it the way I think we do when we're cooking as well. So I think that part is huge. From there, there's, I think, two big things I would think about. One is we want to manage blood sugar for kids as much as possible. So focusing on protein-rich foods and healthy fats is a huge way to go about it. Now, we know kids are always going to want things like fruit and carbohydrates, and those aren't necessarily a bad thing, but we want to make sure that they're balanced out from a protein and fat perspective. So encouraging those type of foods and making sure that they are available, if nothing else, for children to choose from is a huge part of what we do. And then if kids aren't eating a lot of vegetables, we want children, especially as they grow older, to be eating more vegetables, but it's not something that we stress over with our parents. And so what we want to focus on is let's make sure that they're getting fiber somewhere. And a lot of times that's going to be coming from fruits. So making sure that we're eating whole fruits. We do a lot of like cooked apples with a lot of parents. That's a great source of fiber, feeds beneficial bacteria. And that's really what we're going after, is we want to make sure that the good bacteria that they have residing in their gut actually have the nutrients to thrive, and fiber is what we're going after. So if vegetables are not going to happen, just lean towards the fruit. I know a lot of parents are often a little bit more nervous to do that because we're thinking about fructose and sugar and things like that, but it's offset by the fiber side of things. And so that's a really great way to go about that and create those healthy habits for kids that will, in theory, eventually turn into vegetables.
It's such a nice balanced perspective. And that's really what I always try to do with my community is like, how can we find balance instead of feeling like we have to cut everything or we have to be afraid of everything. We have to do everything right. Such a good reminder. We were just having a conversation with my two middle kids, age 13 and 16, last night about orange juice. Mm-hmm. and fructose and fruit sugars. And they were like, wait, are you just saying fruit is bad? I'm like, no, fruit's wonderful. But we talked about how orange juice happens and looked up like how many oranges are in a cup of orange juice? Well, 3. And so I picked up, like, my kid had a pint glass on the table. I said, could you drink this whole glass of orange juice? Well, yeah, he said. I said, could you eat 6 oranges in one sitting with the rest of your meal? And he was like, I don't know. And I'm like, that's because oranges have fiber in them. Like, they're packaged in nature appropriately to fill us up, where after 1 or 2, we'd say, I'm good. Like, the orange was delicious, but I'm satisfied now. Yeah. Whereas the juice doesn't do that. So that's really good, I think, for parents to remember and talk to your kids about. And I think the whole fruit versus pieces of the fruit, like juice, totally different story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it makes it so much easier for parents to not be too stressed out about what their kids are eating. I'm sure you remember this when your children were little, is they love fruit. You go through so much fruit when they're little. And I don't think it really changes as they grow older either, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think kids are very intuitive. They know what their body needs, and kids have a lot of energy. They got to get that energy from somewhere and nourish themselves. And a lot of that can come from things like fructose.
Yes. Thank you for that. Cooked apples, I'm curious, with the skins on, is that an important piece?
Yes, absolutely. Right. With the skins on.
I love that. Again, our Life Skills Now summer camp, our family is teaching how to make applesauce with the skins. So I'm like, yay, we're doing it right. That makes me so glad. Well, Deidre, I feel like a lot of parents are probably thinking, this is what I need. I need this testing. I need a person, and I don't know how to find the person locally. So can parents work with you if they're feeling those feelings, and how would they connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have our signature program where we go through all GI healing. So we're thinking about gut health. We do the stool testing, but we also do toxin testing on all of our kids as well. We work with parents for 6 months at a time to make sure that they have a personalized protocol and the community support. I know so often, and I felt this way when I was going through this with my child, is it's kind of a lonely road sometimes to figure this out and do it from a holistic perspective. And so we've created a community where parents can learn from each other, ask each other questions, and just go through that process. Our website is always-growing.com. Our business is Always Growing Wellness. You can also find us on Instagram. Our Instagram handle is alwaysgrowing_littles. So we call all of our pediatric clients our littles.
That's so great. I always love being able to provide my community with resources, that they can use, whether it's online and access to information and education, or virtually access to an actual human who has tons of wisdom and the ability to test and help. What a beautiful thing you're doing. Thank you so much for serving parents. Deidre, I always love to end with a super practical step. Like sometimes we receive so much information in a half-hour podcast and then we're like, I don't know what to do. I will do nothing. So let's say we're going to do one thing. What would you want parents to do with our interview today?
Yeah. So, I think one of the biggest ways that we all get exposed to toxins is actually in our homes. And so there's some really easy things that we can do in our homes to make sure that we are reducing that exposure as much as possible. And that's really thinking about air quality. Air is one of the biggest ways that we get exposed. There's some estimates that 70 to 100% of homes have mold. Not all mold is hurting us, right? But if we improve the air quality in our homes, it means that what we're breathing in is significantly less. So thinking about things like air purifiers is a really great way to go. If that's not within your budget, open up your windows and the doors. Even if it's, a little chillier outside, getting fresh air is huge. If it's easier to go outside to get fresh air, I'm a huge advocate of getting outdoors. It's great for kids in the same way that it's important for adults. But even just changing your air quality to make sure that what you're breathing in your home is going to be beneficial can be a really huge impact that's really easy and often a free way just to improve toxin burden as a whole.
Simple step. Love it. My middle schooler came home yesterday and said, did you know that every month we breathe in the equivalent of a credit card in microplastics? And I'm like, whoa. So fun facts, right?
Yep.
And I'm looking over at my air doctor going, is it on? Yes, it's on. It's running. Good. We gotta do what we can. And I'll say the air doctor has been helpful because we had our home tested for all sorts of stuff when we found a leak. And particulate count, which is the amount of stuff in the air that we're breathing in, that, listeners might not, should be below 500. Average home is above 1,500. So we were like 520 or something. And he said, you're probably way better than most people on your block because of your air filters. I was like, they're doing something. That was nice. That was really nice to hear. Yeah. Deidre Bloomquist, thank you so much for this great interview. It feels very practical. It feels doable. And it feels like there's a path to healing for the mamas and papas out there who are listening, whose kids really are suffering with skin issues. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Healthy Parenting Handbook podcast. I hope your brain feels fed and your heart feels full and that you feel connected, knowing that there are other parents on this journey with you. We're just trying to raise healthy, independent adults. And the next time you think, man, there is no handbook for this job. Now there is the Healthy Parenting Handbook. Look up the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please leave a review, my friends, as that helps other parents who need this information to find us. And of course, subscribe. That's a huge help. You can also look for our shorts as a reel on Instagram at Katie Kimball Kids Cook, or subscribe to the Healthy Parenting Handbook Shorts channel on YouTube. You'll get those bite-sized portions of healthy parenting advice.